Grief, it's a natural emotion and also a natural process, but so painful. And today I'm going to talk to somebody who's got a lot of experience in this area, Sue O'Brien, who will help us to understand the process and how we can help ourselves through it with a lot more ease. But before that, I'm going to ask Sue what it is that stresses her out on a day-to-day basis.
My stress is when I've got an awful lot in my diary and I'm trying to hold it all in my head and remember everything I've got to do. So I've learned not to rely completely on my phone. So every morning I sit down at breakfast when I'm relaxed and I get a piece of paper and I just note down all the appointments I've got for the day. And if there's anything in particular I need to get for them or prepared for, I just write it all down. And that somehow over the years has helped me to have a calmer day.
Yeah.
Feel quite stressed about how much I've got to achieve within that day. If I write it all down, I just follow it through and I tick it off as I go along. And it probably to some sounds a little bit too much, but it really helps me to stay calm and to get everything I want to do.
I think there is something very positive, isn't there, about writing things down. And also you've got a sheet with everything that you need on the sheet so that it's out of your head and onto the piece of paper. So it's kind of a contained look at your day. So I can understand very much how that would be soothing as a good start to a busy day. That's a great tip. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Right, so now let's talk about grief. So as I mentioned earlier, it's both an emotion and a process, isn't it? And you've done a lot of work helping people through their grief journey. What are the kind of things that you notice in people's experience of grief?
I think the first thing that happens to virtually everybody is shock. Whether you know that that person that you love was ill and you've lost them, or whether it's happened very suddenly, unexpectedly, the first thing that most people still have is shock. It doesn't matter if someone has been ill because, in a way you are expecting something to happen to them, but actually when it comes to it, it's still a shock. So that's the very first thing that I think most people will experience in grief.
Yeah, and what comes after that? Because there's a kind of grief curve, isn't there? What is the thing that happens after the shock that somebody experiences?
Well, in nearly all cases, people will have tremendous pain.
Mm-hmm.
It's left them feeling very bereft, really,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps not knowing what to do next, almost unable to step forward, if you like, not knowing what to do. If we're very lucky, we have the loved one that we've had an extremely good relationship with. So it is exceptionally painful. But what we've got to remember is that some people don't always have a good relationship with the loved one. And so sometimes people are very, very reluctant to admit that they have some kind of a release, I think is the word, actually.
Yeah.
So although most of us will be, very upset by what has happened, in some cases there is a release. So there are both sides of the coin when you start in that grief process, but generally everyone will experience pain. But after the shock, in most cases, people have to become very involved in the process of dealing with that death in very practical ways. So they can become absorbed in all of that. And once that process is over, i.e. dealing with the funeral and any other issues around the death, once that has passed and you've been extremely busy doing all these things, the next part of it often is the shock that hits you, or the wave of grief that hits you when all those processes have finished.
Yeah, because your kind of life is filled up by things you've got to do. There's an expectation of you have to arrange a funeral, you have to invite people, you have to organize the the catering and all these kinds of things. They kind of fill up your time. But then there's the emptiness, isn't there, of life ahead. And can I just pick up on something that you said, Sue, because I think it's an important point rather. When you said if the person hasn't had a good relationship with the person that's gone, that there can be a tremendous amount of regret at lost opportunities about what could have been. And so that might yield guilt or about their own role in that, or maybe anger towards the other person, that they didn't make it easier. So that there can be that which kind of muddies the water as well.
Definitely. And actually, funnily enough, one of the biggest things people don't expect in the grief process is anger.
Mm.
It seems like a funny word when you've actually lost someone, but sometimes people can feel very alone because they're angry that that person has left them behind.
Yeah.
They haven't had the opportunity to say some of the things that they want to say.
Yeah.
There is an anger there, and it's not an emotion people expect in grief, actually.
Yeah.
We do expect guilt, because most people will say, well, why didn't I do this, or why didn't I call, or why didn't I pop in, those kind of things. But the anger part of it is not something that a lot of people expect.
Yeah. And that anger can be at the person they've lost, but it can be if they have beliefs around God. It can be, how could you do this to me? So the anger can be projected in any number of ways, and is a natural part of the grief cycle, but it can be a bit shocking to the individual. I think there's something else that's very important when they are a significant person in your life, that sometimes we don't realize that they feel part of us. And then it's like, well, who am I now? Especially if it's a partner, it's almost like walking with one leg. You just kind of feel like, oh, this feels really weird, even if they didn't have, you're perfectly independent on your own, but just that absence of them is very much present, if that is not an oxymoron. And I hear things where suddenly people aren't invited to events because now they're single, and it kind of upsets the balance at a dinner table. So there's all these kind of really weird things that go on as well when somebody has been bereaved.
Definitely. And I think that's one of the hardest things for some people that are grieving, is that many people don't know quite what to say to them. You get that there is a whole history around the person that you've lost, but often people are scared to come up to a grieving person and say, I'm really, really sorry. I don't know quite what to say, but I'd love to go for a coffee with you, or please feel free to call me at any time. It doesn't really matter what you say to that person, but don't ignore them.
Yeah.
Don't leave them alone to think, and especially at work, if you're in a workplace and someone is grieving, it can, if people don't talk to you and treat you normally, it can be quite isolating if they do that. And it doesn't just apply to work, it applies normally as well. But let's say, for example, you've lost an elderly person. There's a lot of comments similar to, they've had a good innings. That's one of the ones that often comes up.
Yeah.
See, that's not particularly comforting for the person that's just lost someone with a massive history with them.
Yeah.
So if you can avoid saying little things like that, it's probably much easier for them. If you just act normally, you can see they're upset, and just register with them that you can see that they're feeling the way they are, and that you're very happy to help if you can.
Yeah.
That's
I think that's really lovely. It is so hard, because what one person might find comforting, another person might find, I can't believe they said that. So it's just trying to be as sensitive as possible, and maybe saying, look, if you want to talk, I'm here. I'm always here. Should we make plans for a coffee? and actually
Yeah.
maybe make plans rather than, let me know, because sometimes people feel like they can't phone and say, can we have that coffee?
Yeah.
So, or maybe checking in sometimes, or I don't know, there's any number of ways. But so the worst thing to say is they had a good innings.
Not a great one.
I think I've said that. Oh my goodness. What would be the best thing to say, do you think?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. Personally, I just say, look, I'm really sorry. I've heard that you've lost someone really close to you, and I'm sure that's very painful at the moment. But if there's any way I can help, please, just lift the phone, or I'll give. Actually, one of the things that really does help sometimes is maybe people don't necessarily want to talk, so you could either text them or WhatsApp them and just check in with them. Maybe it is difficult to talk as well. So, modern technology can be helpful in the sense that you can say perhaps something that you wouldn't say face to face with someone, but you can at least say something warm without feeling awkward.
Yeah.
So
I remember a friend of mine, when I lost my mother, a friend of mine said to me, would you like to go out and you can tell me all about her? And I thought, oh, God, that would be fantastic. So we talked about my mum, and mostly it was just, actually making me want to fill up. Isn't it amazing? This is like 6 years ago. It was lovely to be able to talk about her this is the kind of person she was. And yes, I'm very sad, but it was quite uplifting to have that asked of me. And she did it beautifully, by the way. She was a great listener. So that was very nice for me, and hopefully that might be a tip for other people that might help as well. So, in terms of the bereaved, what are the things that they can do to ease their transition through this natural, painful process?
Well, I think this is going to sound a very silly perhaps for some people, but you need to be kind to yourself. If you're finding it difficult, and people do in grief, get up and get going. That's one of the first things that can be very, very difficult, to just get up and face the day. If for example, lying in a hot bath or having a hot shower, or just sitting, giving yourself an extra cup of tea, just anything at all that you would normally do that you feel comforted by, you should do, really.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't feel like eating. When grief is at its most extreme, one of the things they forget to do is eat properly.
Yeah.
Well, even if you don't necessarily eat masses, please eat something, just a little something, that will keep you going through the day. Because one of the things that's tiring, grief is tiring. It's really tiring, and it expends a lot of energy, and also be kind to yourself. A lot of people don't want to cry. They have a fear of crying almost. But actually, crying releases chemicals in the body.
Yes.
And it releases the stress of grief. So I know that some people have a fear of crying because they fear it's like a tap, you can't turn it off. But that's not the case, because actually once you've cried, you're exhausted, you release the stress, and actually, it's a perfectly normal and healthy thing to do.
I like to think of it as processing the emotion, because a lot of people think they've got to be, especially men, they've got to be strong, stiff upper lip, I'm bigger than this. But actually, it's processing the emotion. It's important that it is allowed to process rather than be contained and internalized or powered through. So to me, that would be a very natural, normal thing to do.
Another thing that is a tendency in grief is to fill your day, be really, really busy, which is totally understandable because it's a coping mechanism. You're coping with your grief, and by getting really, really busy, you don't actually have to think about it. But that can only go on for so long. People do have to do things that help themselves. That's totally understandable. but please try not to make yourself so busy that you can't even process your grief. That's really important, that you do give yourself time to think about it. It's not what you naturally want to do, but it's important that you do that, I think.
Absolutely. And I guess that the final thing would be, well, a bit like I said with my friend, to be able to talk about it to somebody. So whether that's a friend who's very sensitive, like my friend was, and said, you know, let's tell me about your mum, or whether it's using somebody like Cruse, being able to talk about it in a way that is free. I don't mean free of cost. I mean, you're able to express yourself freely.
Yes.
Is going to be, and somebody knows what they're doing or is very sensitive to your needs, I think is really helpful too.
I totally agree. And one of the things that I'll only speak about my own personal experience when I lost several family members very close in succession. Eventually, trying to cope, as I was saying, I was busying myself completely. And eventually I was exhausted. I went to the GP, and it was the GP that said to me, how about you think about contacting Cruse? That's how the process started for me. It wasn't something I'd even considered or thought about. I didn't even know they existed. But there are organisations like Cruse and others that you can reach out to, and they can give you help. Some people will find it difficult to reach out to them, but you know, if you feel the courage and you can get that help, it is a tremendous release.
Yeah,
it does help to process it.
yeah. Thank you so much, Sue. That's been incredibly helpful. And I'm sure that many people, especially in these very uncertain times, will benefit from what you've said here today. Now, I always ask my clients if there is a book that they've read which they have found inspiring that might help others too. And Sue, you've got a particular one in mind, haven't you?
I do. I'll give you a quick look at the cover.
Yeah, so The Forgotten Highlander.
Forgotten Highlander.
Yeah.
This is a story of a young man who was barely 20, went out to Singapore and got caught up in the Japanese invasion, and eventually ended up at the River Kwai. But what was wonderful about this book is that this man, or young man, went through tremendous hardship, really, really difficult situation. And towards the end of the book, you think, my goodness, he went through so much, but he did come out at the other end. He was able to come back home, and he was able to start to create a new and a normal life again. And it's an incredibly uplifting book, because it makes you realize, even if you've been through tremendous adversity, you can still come back to normal. You can start a life again.
Yeah.
That I found incredible.
I do too, and you know, so the war and the Japanese invasion, I can just imagine some of the details in that. But there's a phrase that I love, which is "this too shall pass." And I think sometimes when people are in situations of great adversity, they think this is how life will always be. But the recognition that this too shall pass can really ease people's journeys into the next phase of their life, which hopefully will be a lot more positive.
Absolutely. It was very uplifting in the end, this book.
Thank you so much. That's terrific, Sue. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I'm sure that many people will benefit from what you've had to say here today. And if you have enjoyed it, do please like and share. You never know, that might land just at the right time for somebody who needs it. And if you have any comments or tips about how you've been able to deal with your grief, then do please add that below. That might help others too. Take care now.